Greetings, and welcome back to the 31 Nights of Frights. In the first episode, we took a look at what is considered to be the first true horror feature-length movie, the German expressionism classic, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1920. In today's video, we're staying in Germany and taking a look at probably the most famous horror movie of the silent era, and also the movie that spawned horror's earliest icon, 1922's Nosferatu, directed by 𝙆𝙊𝙄𝙎𝙗. Nosferatu is actually the earliest surviving adaptation of Bram Stoker's 1897 novel, Dracula, albeit a pretty loose one, and it's actually widely regarded as the first proper vampire film. However, the film is an unlicensed and unauthorized adaptation of Stoker's novel, and despite changing all the characters' names and not being completely 100% faithful to the plot of Stoker's original book, Stoker's estate still hit them with a big lawsuit, a lawsuit of which they won, and as a result of that, the courts actually ordered for every copy of Nosferatu to be completely destroyed. Obviously, someone didn't do their job correctly.
Didn't do a very good job.
As several copies of the film actually survived, and those copies were saved and restored decades later in 1994. It's also worthy of noting that Nosferatu contributed its own ideas to the world of vampire lore. And for those who haven't seen Nosferatu, this is a spoiler warning. At the end of the film, the vampire Count 𝙁𝙁 is ultimately destroyed from the exposure to sunlight, as opposed to traditionally being pierced in the heart with a stake. Sunlight destroying Dracula was not an aspect of Stoker's original novel, but since the release of Nosferatu, this trope has been replicated in many vampire films since, and sunlight is now fully accepted to be fatal to a vampire. Just like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Nosferatu is a film that was born from the German expressionist movement in cinema. As I explained in the first episode, characteristics of this movement include angular shapes, stark colours and dramatic shadows and lighting that distort reality. All of the above are on display in The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. However, Nosferatu contrasts Caligari massively, despite both of these films being within this movement. To compare the visuals of these two movies, the first and most apparent difference is that while Caligari's world is extremely dreamlike and, a lot of the time, looks like a surrealist painting with walls, doors and windows twisted into strange angular shapes and shadows and highlights being painted on the sets, Nosferatu is much more grounded within the real world. This is mainly due to the fact that a lot of this movie is filmed on location in real places, whereas Caligari is filmed entirely on built-up sets. And that's not to say that Nosferatu falls short with its German expressionism, it just attacks the movement in a different way than how Caligari did. Nosferatu is still an extremely surreal film, and all the hallmarks of the movement are there within it. In particular, Nosferatu makes massive use of dramatic lighting and shadows throughout the film to create its aesthetic. I mean, the most iconic imagery from this film is that shot of Count 𝙁𝙁's shadow ascending the stairs. That few seconds of film has been etched into cinema history and the minds of millions of people across the world, and continues to do so way over 100 years after its initial release. It's up there with the image of Max von Sydow standing outside the McNeil residence in The Exorcist, and Jack Nicholson peering his face through the bathroom door in The Shining. When you look up the definition of the word iconic within the dictionary, this imagery should be there as the definition. In addition to its use of dramatic lighting, Nosferatu also features the angular architecture and geometric shapes within its set design and location. An example of this would be another infamous shot from the movie where Count 𝙁𝙁 slowly approaches a door with a pointed archway that just barely fits his tall, gangly build. As the doorway frames the vampire entering with his animal-like movements, we're given what is probably the creepiest imagery within the movie and another iconic moment. On top of this, the movie's locations, such as 𝙁𝙁's castle for example, fit the German expressionist style perfectly. The castle itself is very blocky in shape, with angular rooftops and slanted geometry. I mean, this is a great example of art imitating life, right? I mean, look at this section of the castle that is placed upon this jagged cliff. Doesn't that look like something from 𝙎𝙬𝙎𝙎, or for a more modern example, something straight out of a Tim Burton film? It would fit in perfectly with Halloween Town from The Nightmare Before Christmas. It's crazy that this is a location that exists in real life. It's the 13th century 𝙆𝙊𝙎𝙎 castle in Slovakia that was used to represent 𝙁𝙁's Transylvanian residence, and all the locations seen in the film look exactly the same today. You can actually go and visit the castle yourself, and they even have a life-size statue of Count 𝙁𝙁 there as a sign of respect to its cinematic heritage. Some would argue that this is just simply Gothic architecture, and of course, you would be correct. But I think it really does go to show just how much German expressionism and horror go hand in hand. Finally, another aspect of the expressionist movement that is seen fully on display in Nosferatu is the dramatic acting and super expressive performances from its cast. For example, there's a character in the movie called Knock, who is based on the character of Renfield from Bram Stoker's Dracula novel, and his performance, I swear, is just as creepy as Max Schreck's as the vampire. Knock is a servant of 𝙁𝙁's and is absolutely insane, and boy, can you tell. Just look at his face over 100 years later, and to me that is still freaky. I think this will be a good time to talk about Count 𝙁𝙁 himself, as played by German actor Max Schreck. And for those Batman fans out there, yes, Christopher Walken's character in Batman Returns was named after this actor. Apparently, at the time of the film's release, Max Schreck's performance as 𝙁𝙁 was so terrifying that rumours spread around that he was, indeed, a real vampire. Now that is a serious compliment to that man's acting abilities. In fact, this whole theory acts as the premise of the 2000 film Shadow of the Vampire, a black comedy fictionalised account of the making of Nosferatu, starring Willem Dafoe as Max Schreck. Another trivia fact that I have related to Nosferatu is a rather macabre and unsettling one regarding the film's director, F.W. Murnau. As in July 2015, Murnau's grave was broken into and his skull was actually stolen.
That is messed up, yo!
Apparently, wax residue was found at the location of his gravesite, leading people to believe that candles were actually lit, potentially for purposes related to the occult or for a ceremonial significance. As of today, nobody knows who committed this act, and the location of Murnau's skull is still unknown. Now that's an extremely grisly trivia fact, but it's such a bizarre and weird story. I just can't get my head around that one. Oh, that was not a pun that was intended at all. But anyway, coming back to Nosferatu, something I've always found unsettling about Max Schreck's performance as Count 𝙁𝙁 is the way he moves around so unnaturally and slow. The shot of him rising up from his coffin on the ship is another one that stays with you forever. Coupling that with his haunting visage, which is also very animal-like, and those long, slender fingers is what pushed Count 𝙁𝙁 to become what I believe as horror's first true icon. To this day, we're still getting merchandise made of this movie. Just look at the upcoming release from NECA Toys as an example of that. I 100% believe that Count 𝙁𝙁 deserves to be up there with all the horror icons that came after him, from the Golden Age and onwards. It's those haunting visuals of the vampire lurking in the shadows, mixed with the expressive acting and that creepy silent era vibe that I believe gives this film its surreal and otherworldly sort of feeling. It's a perfect example of a film from that time that actually benefits from being silent, and it uses its era's limitations to its own advantage. Apparently there's now a remake in the works that will star Bill Skarsgård as Count 𝙁𝙁, so it will definitely be interesting to see how that turns out and how over 100 years later they go about making this movie again. Also, I personally think that Bill is a perfect casting choice for this film, and I'm pretty confident that he'll do an absolutely stellar job portraying Count Orlok. Again, this is a film that I've just barely scraped the surface with, as over 100 years later, it's still being analysed to death. People watch this film and take away all kinds of different meanings, and a lot of people believe that this film has undertones of social commentary regarding immigration and anti-Semitism. But it's safe to say that the legacy of films like Nosferatu and other films within the German Expressionism era of silent movies have this importance that cannot be understated. Still to this day, the movies from this era are inspiring artists and filmmakers all around the world, which is a clear indication that the DNA of horror movies lie within these films. And by the end of the 1920s, the influence of these movies were already spreading far and wide. German cinematographer Karl Freund, who worked on various movies in the Expressionist movement, including Paul Wegener's The Golem from 1920, The Last Laugh from 1924, which is also directed by F.W. Murnau, and Fritz Lang's Metropolis from 1927, was hired across the pond in America as the cinematographer on Universal's newest horror movie. That film being 1931's Dracula. And this leads us directly to our next movie in horror film history, and also brings us into a whole new era of cinema, the Golden Age. So join me in the next episode where we take a look at our very first Universal Monsters movie. See you there.